Good morning. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jim Lockhart, and I serve with Senator Kent Conrad as the co-chair of BBC's Commission on Retirement Security and Personal Savings. Earlier this summer, after 2 years of pretty tough negotiations, our 19-member commission published a consensus report with bipartisan recommendations on ways to increase access to retirement plans, increase workplace retirement plans, promote personal savings, and also importantly, strengthen Social Security. We also supported the reforms from BPC's Disability Insurance Working Group, which last year published its own set of proposals to improve Social Security's disability program, and a program that needs reform, as we all know. It's been on GAO's high risk watch since 2003. So it's one of those programs that we really need to work on, and that's why I'm so happy to be here today. Several recommendations from those two projects have already been passed into law or been incorporated in pending legislation, and they have broad bipartisan support. Yet a lot of work needs to be done. In particular, there's often an overlooked connection between the risk of disability and retirement security challenges. Having served as number 2 at Social Security, I'm very familiar with that link. According to estimates by Social Security, 1 in 4 20-year-olds will experience a disability before reaching retirement age. For those who do, it may mean fewer years during which they earn a paycheck, and contribute to a retirement account, and potentially more years they have to make those savings last. Today we are bringing together some very knowledgeable experts with different perspectives to explore the challenge and discuss possible solutions. To kick us off, it is my pleasure to introduce Rick McKinney, President and CEO of Unum Group, a major provider of employee benefits. Most relevant for today's discussion is that they are one of the nation's largest private disability insurance providers. Rick will introduce our keynote speaker in a few moments, but before that, we would look forward to hearing some of his thoughts on the role disability insurance can play in helping to address these issues. I'd also like to thank Rick for attending today because it's his birthday, apparently. Rick?
Thank you, Jim, for that introduction and for revealing that to everybody in the room. Not sure how you found out, but I do appreciate that. Thanks for that. Very happy to be with you today representing one of the nation's leading providers of employee benefits. We mentioned disability, but also a broader array of employee benefits. And we're really proud of what we do at Unum. And because we share some of the same goals, we're also proud to support what happens here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. While the current political environment makes it difficult to find solutions to problems where everyone agrees they exist, BBC meaningfully impacts the debate by bringing together relevant stakeholders, including top policy experts from across the political spectrum, to create an environment conducive to crafting and building support for common sense ideas. Given our focus on employee benefits at Unum, we have a unique view of the relationship between employers and their employees. As you know, the workforce of the future will look different than it does today. Employees are working longer, and for the first time, 4 generations are working side by side. A labor shortage driven by demographic shifts we are seeing will make acquiring and retaining employees increasingly more important. While there's some debate about how much of this impact these changes are having on the traditional employment relationship, one thing is clear. The financial responsibility and decision-making for employee benefits is increasingly shifting from employers to employees. Consequently, employees now have a larger responsibility for understanding their benefits and protecting against the financial implications of unexpected life events. Which brings me to this point. One of the most significant issues facing our nation is the lack of a strong financial safety net for all of our citizens, particularly those in the middle class who lack the resources to sustain themselves in the event of an unexpected major expense or of income interruption due to illness or injury. Statistics underscoring the financial fragility of typical American family are all too familiar but bear repeating. 67% of American households would find it somewhat or very difficult to meet financial obligations if their paycheck were delayed by just 1 week. 69% of Americans have less than $1,000 in savings, and less than 1/4 have enough of emergency savings to cover 6 months or more of their expenses. And it brings me back to a point that Jim just mentioned. 1 in 4 U.S. workers will become disabled at some point in their career. For those facing an income loss due to illness or injury, the Social Security Disability Insurance Program does provide an important baseline safety net, but is insufficient for most workers. The benefit is often very small, averaging just $1,166 a month, or about $14,000 per year, and is reserved for terminal disabilities or those expected to last at least a year. Add to that the fact that nearly 70% of workers who apply for Social Security disability insurance are denied, and the need for some sort of additional private protection becomes increasingly clear. The most direct impact of disability insurance is financial security through wage replacement. However, early intervention is also critical to maximizing the potential for disabled workers to stay in their jobs with accommodations or to return to work as soon as they're able to do so. But we also know that disability insurance improves outcomes on the topic we have at hand today, and that is retirement security. Loss of income due to disability during a person's working years is a major hardship and also a driver of retirement plan leakage, because many workers believe they have no choice but to draw on their retirement account to cover living expenses while they are not working. This in turn significantly reduces a person's chance of having a financially secure retirement. And this may sound intuitive, but it's often overlooked. And that's why we at UNM are excited about the EBRI study available today, which quantifies the impact of disability on retirement readiness, comparing those with or without disability coverage. This study reinforces other research available at disabilitycanhappen.org, showing not only are workers more financially secure with disability insurance, employers also benefit from a more engaged and loyal workforce. And the government itself benefits because of reduced spending on social safety net programs. If we truly want a well-protected workforce that can withstand the type of disability-related income interruption, we need to do a better job of protecting more Americans. Insurers and employers need to work together to inform and educate workers about the need for this type of coverage and to put in place a framework that helps ensure more workers are covered. So what can we do? For example, some employers enroll employees into their disability plans on an opt-out basis. And the impact of that arrangement on participation levels is tremendous. It can more than double what participation looks like on that basis. However, many employers are actually reluctant to do so, in part given the confusion about laws in this area. Just this year, in recognition of the importance of this coverage to average workers, the state of Maine passed legislation to encourage more opt-out enrollments and arrangements. We're hopeful other states will pass similar legislation. Federal legislation clarifying the rules around auto-enrollment based on prior successful efforts to increase participation in workplace retirement plans offer tremendous promise as well, particularly for employers doing business in multiple states. Thank you again to the BPC for your attention to important topics impacting our nation and for convening this event to focus on disability and retirement. I look forward to a very productive discussion today. Let me now turn to the very high honor of introducing our next speaker, Senator Mark Warner. Senator Warner has had a distinguished and successful career in business. He first brought executive expertise and a collaborative and inclusive approach to public policy making to the Virginia Governor's Mansion, and more recently has served as one of our nation's most thoughtful and respected senators. He has shown great leadership in a number of policy areas, perhaps none greater than the need to increase financial security for today's evolving workforce. Please join me in welcoming Senator Mark Warner.
Well, thank you, Rick, for that introduction. Happy birthday. We are at least polite enough not to say what age it is today, but happy birthday. Thank you for all the good work you do at UNM. Thank you as well for keeping my 30-year friend Scott Maker gainfully employed as well. I appreciate that. to the Bipartisan Policy Center. It is great to be back. I've got my BPC purple tie on today as a reflection of being here today. I want to commend both Jim and my dear friend Kent Conrad for the very important and critical work you've done on this subject matter as well. And I mentioned this to Rick beforehand. I want to take a moment and within the context of disability and retirement benefits, step back and give you some thoughts on how I've been looking at this topic over the last year and a half plus on a maybe slightly broader context that it directly and indirectly affects, I think, the discussion that the panel will be bringing forth after I'm done. And again, I want to commend also the work from EBRI. I think that kind of solid research adds to where we ought to be headed with the policy discussion. Let's start with where we are. Well, first where we are is, thank goodness we're only, 20 days away from the election? It's almost going to be safe to come out of our houses again and not have to deal with the back and forth. But I think one of the things that this political debate season has shown, regardless of kind of the back and forth of last night and the last couple of debates, is that there is an enormously underlying unease in America at this point. Regardless of kind of some of the more recent comments by Mr. Trump, if we look back earlier in the season, when you've got both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump saying the system is rigged and is not working for enough Americans, all of us who are here, and frankly all of us who care about where our country's headed, need to not dismiss that, but recognize that there are some underlying fundamental shifts taking place in our economy. I've been, as Rick was kind enough to mention, I think I've got a year or two more where I can say I've spent longer time in the private sector than I have in the public sector. The free enterprise system has been very good to me. But I have to tell you, the free enterprise system, or modern American capitalism in its current form, with its focus on short-term, oftentimes quarterly-based results over long-term value creation, is not working for enough people. Now, that's an enormous challenge, and I'm going to talk about 4 things where I think we can potentially address it. And one of my great hopes is that, let's assume conventional wisdom for a moment, and Hillary and Tim win, and the Democrats eke out a small majority in the Senate, and Republicans keep the House. If we don't, those of us kind of in the elected leadership of our country, find a way to change the political narrative. If my party, in taking the Senate and maintaining the presidency, simply comes out and tries to relitigate all of the existing issues that have already been litigated, even though there are a vast number, I can assure you, of at least Republican senators who want to get things done, who recognize that we have rightfully earned our 8% approval ratings, we're not going to be able to get things done unless we can change the political narrative. And I think changing the political narrative about making capitalism work for all Americans again in an inclusive way could be a path out of this. Let me share with you the 4 strands of where I think this discussion heads. The first, and the one that is candidly most addresses our topic today, is the fact that America is unique in that we are the only nation, only industrial nation, at least that I'm aware of. Gene Struble may tell me differently, but I think we are the only industrial nation in the world that set up our social compact or social contract back in the 1930s and 1940s that was based upon not citizenship or some other characteristic, but was actually based upon your employment status. We said we are going to create a social insurance system that includes disability, retirement, health, unemployment, workman's comp, entirely based upon the premise that you are going to go work for a single firm, work for that firm for a long time. My dad worked for the same firm for 40 years, and part of the benefit back and forth was that government would help subsidize this social insurance. Well, the funny thing has happened over the last 30 years. I got interested in this in the last couple years when I was and had a chance to talk here at the BPC before on the emergence of the gig economy. The gig economy and the platforms, it's exciting, it's fresh, it's new. It's still relatively tiny as a share of our workforce. What's not tiny is the fact that starting in the 1990s, virtually every major corporation took every function that was not core and outsourced it, either literally or figuratively. So the janitor, the cafeteria worker, no longer work for the corporate, but they have been outsourced to some other entity. So that today, in 2016, we already have an economy where 1/3 at a minimum of our workforce is in some form of contingent status. Some of them may be our kids who are working in the gig economy. A great deal more are folks who are traditional 1099 independent contractors. A whole host of other folks are cobbling together 2 jobs to make a living. Some may be working in traditional employment, but on a short-term basis. But the result of that 1/3 in a non-traditional long-term employment status means that this part of our workforce, and that number is projected to rise dramatically, has enormous volatility in their income and actually has none of the social insurance that was created in the 1930s and 1940s in our traditional American social contract. So when bad things happen, when workers become disabled, whether they are full-time employees or contingent employees, those who fall into the contingent category, unless they've got some level of private disability insurance, fall completely through the cracks. So one area that I would hope that BPC and others can, and Maureen, raise your hand from my staff here, we're looking at very deeply, is can we create, maintaining the value of Social Security and Medicare and some of the well-established government programs, but can we create for this 1/3 of our workforce that is already in some level of contingent status a portable benefit system? So that from that first dollar earned, some of that dollar will attach to you and go into categories like health, retirement, some form of disability. And candidly, in this world where there is so much income volatility, there may be a whole new need to re-examine things like unemployment, because if you choose when you work and how you work, maybe we need that $500,000 emergency fund that you can draw upon on an occasional basis, so that you don't go into the debt spiral because of the statistics that Rick laid out. So a portable benefit system that works for all ought to be an area where, again, Democrats and Republicans come together. Second part of the changing nature of the workforce is that virtually no matter what job that you are hired for, in a world that is going to be wrought with technology, globalization, and I can't even imagine as we think about AI and all of these other things coming down the line, how do we make sure that workers continue to increase their skills in this changing nature of the economy? If you accept my premise that nobody's going to work for the same firm for 40 years, and they're going to be moving from job to job, then we've got a real conundrum here in terms of how we continue to upgrade our workforce skills. In the old economy, if you went to work for the factory and you worked for 40 years, even if you were a low to moderate skilled employee, it was still in the company's best interest to skill you up. Today, if you're going to move along, there is actually no incentive for any company to train up anyone who makes less than, pick your number, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year. Because that person might move along, and if you invest in them, gosh, if they move to another job, you're going to be out your investment. Second argument I would make, and I have to acknowledge as somebody who was a governor and now a senator, and as a governor was very proud of all of the workforce training programs we had in Virginia. The truth is, government doesn't do a very good job of workforce training. Our inputs versus the outputs in terms of actually metric-driven increased skill levels really is a pretty spotty record. And the $20 to $60 billion that we spend annually on training, depending on feds and state combined, perhaps there's a better value for that. Business does, candidly, a much better job around workforce training. Why don't we reimagine workforce training in a way that says, we'll pick our cut line, below 50,000, below 60,000. If you train up someone and they end up with a higher metric certified skill level, we're going to change that training from a deduction to a credit and make that credit potentially worth even more than $1. Using the R&D tax credit kind of idea is you start with a baseline and you have to increase above that level. But the difference would be that we would pay out that credit to the business, not on an annual basis, but on a 3-year running basis. The vast majority in the first year, but some in that second and third year with a tail, so that even if that individual moved to a different firm, as long as he or she had a higher skill and got a higher salary, it would still be in the company's best interest to make that investment in human capital. We need a whole new mindset around how we make sure our workforce continues to meet the needs of a changing economy. Third item, and this is one that has a great deal of controversy. I spent the last couple days in New York with a lot of finance guys and usually getting battered around on this. But I think something is different with capitalism today than the capitalism that I was lucky enough to participate in back in the early 80s when I got into the cell phone business. Something is fundamentally different when the average hold on a public stock has gone from 8 years to 4 months. Something is different when corporate profits 30 years ago, which 50% were reinvested back in the enterprise, oftentimes in plant and equipment and additional employment, has switched to the last couple of quarters where we've seen 95% plus of corporate profits being spent on share buyback and dividends. Something is different when I've talked to some of my friends in the railroad industry who describe their shareholders not as owners but as renters, and where major companies with enormous needs for CapEx are taking those CapEx dollars and actually using them to buy back shares to fend off activist investors. Now, I know anytime you talk about approaching the market in a different way, you immediately get blowback and you immediately say we can't turn America's robust economy into the Japanese economy. I agree with that. But I do think there are ways, if you accept the premise that this focus on short-term quarterly returns is destroying long-term value, when you see, and the CEOs I've sat with who say, I've been told to dismantle my workforce training program because this shareholder is not going to be here for the long term. Tell me how much you can bring to the bottom line to push up my EPS for the next 2 quarters because I'm then out of here. Is fundamentally also adding to this break of confidence between Americans and the firms they work with. Now, this gets into a controversial set of recommendations that go from tax and corporate governance, but I think there are things that we ought to look at. Secretary Clinton and a host of others, Democrat and Republican, have thought about a differential capital gains rate based upon a longer-term hold. Not such a radical notion. We had a 3-year hold on capital gains back when President Reagan was president. Could we look at a different form of compensation for folks who manage assets that says we're not going to reward you based on your quarterly returns, but on longer-term returns? Could we look at a company that says, if you want to do a massive amount of share buybacks, and I didn't realize this before I went on this journey, before 1982, share buybacks in America were viewed as illegal because they were viewed as stock manipulation. Maybe we should allow share buybacks, but not allow the benefit increase to inure to the CEO and some of the top management. If it's really in the company's best interest, maybe let them have it. But should they only enrich the top management and shareholders? Maybe if you do a share buyback, you ought to add some of that benefit needs to go to the employees. How do we rethink in this volatile short-termism versus long-termism debate much more emphasis on profit sharing? How do we make a capitalism that works on the long term, not the short term? People sometimes say, well, Mark, you look at Google or you look at Amazon. They haven't returned profits forever, but they still have been valued highly in the market. Well, you look at those companies, particularly a lot of the tech companies that have been so successful, it's because the founders have a different class of shares that allows them protections from the volatility daily back and forth in this quarterly result focus that many public companies feel. So this is an area I know of controversy, but I think a valid debate would be short-termism versus long-termism in capitalism, good or bad. The final area, and one where in a campaign season that is wrought with, oh my gosh, this pleas God, can it just be over soon? What gives me optimism is millennials and a growing group of asset owners that I think really want to invest in companies and enterprises that have some profit motivation, yes, but a way to get to that profit that may not only be short-term, that says you can have a fiduciary duty to your shareholders, but also a fiduciary duty that includes your employees as well. I would commend to all of you, the New York Times on Sunday, the long story on the, I think, the very progressive changes that the leadership at Walmart has made in terms of saying we're no longer going to simply drive cost to the lowest price possible of our employees, but we're going to actually elevate our employees, and with that, we're going to have cleaner, more productive stores and, frankly, a more productive workforce. So I'm very curious, and this is an area where I don't think government should intervene, but there are a whole series of nascent efforts that have come about after the 2008 Great Recession that are looking at what are the metrics of a responsible business. Mike Bloomberg's efforts around the so-called SASB index. Also out of New York, the so-called B Corp movement that's now in 31 states, a kind of a good housekeeping seal about what good corporate performance is. Lynn Rothschild's got a group of asset owners around a concept called inclusive capitalism. There's a group of companies, Costco and Whole Foods and Container Store, that have this whole series of ideas that they call conscientious capitalism. Could we take all of these groups, and this would have to become more from the foundation world probably than government. Government would probably mess it up. But try to encourage them to collaborate together so there are a common set of metrics that then asset owners could look at in terms of companies they invest with. And to my mind, our kids and grandkids, the millennials, they may not be political in the classic sense, but they are very much want to buy from and work for companies that have some sense of social responsibility. So these four pillars of recognizing that we need a social contract for the 21st century where the workforce is at, that we have a workforce training program that continues to recognize we've got to constantly skill up people, and the best delivery mechanism is still through business. Even if that delivery is actually through a community college, it still has to be driven by a business. Third, a robust debate about short-termism versus long-termism, and this notional idea of can there be a series of metrics independently assigned that would be about where responsible businesses would be. Think for a moment if the debate last night was not on some of the traditional issues or with kind of biting comments back and forth or people saying they don't accept our American democratic process, but was instead based around a theme about how do we make capitalism work for every American again? How do we make it an inclusive capitalism where people believe that if they work hard, there's a chance for them to get ahead? That's where this debate ought to be. This is not a Democrat or Republican debate. This is truly a future versus past debate. And if we get this right, and we argue and discuss and debate these issues, then the questions around disability and retirement are going to be front and center. We often think about the enormous challenges, particularly young people face with student debt. One of the things we don't focus on as much, which is the other end of this conundrum, that many of those young people also have aging parents that they have to take care of at the same time. So these questions, Rick, that you at a corporate level are looking at, and Jim, that you and Kent and others have looked at, are absolutely critical. But if we don't change the narrative, if we don't change the narrative from the kind of bickering back and forth that currently dominates our political debate, we're not going to get them answered. So I appreciate the chance again to be back at Bipartisan Policy Center. I want to, as I always say, kudos to Jason and all the BPC team for all the great work you're doing. I'm going to be very interested in getting a report back on the next panel. We are wide open for business. I've got a whole series of policy proposals beneath each of these four buckets. By no means do I think we've got them all right, but as somebody who had a fairly good run as an investor, I am more confident than ever that we're at least in the space of where the debate ought to be happening. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to continuation of this conversation. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you to Senator Warner and Mr. McKinney for some great introductory remarks to kick us off today. You probably don't see my face on the speaker list. That's because I'm pinch hitting today. They called AAA when our moderator unfortunately had an emergency scheduling come up this morning. So I'm glad to be here today, though, with a great group of panelists that are going to carry me through this discussion. Starting at the very end there, we have Jack Vanderhei, who is the research director at the Employee Benefit Research Institute. We've worked closely with Jack here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and he is also known as the modeling guru. And so any questions you have on retirement security related modeling, Jack's the man to ask. Next to him is Aaliyah Wong, who I've also gotten to know quite well. She's with the Chamber of Commerce, and she's the executive director of retirement policy there. And she served on our Social Security Disability Insurance Working Group that we had last year. And so thanks for being here, Aaliyah. Next to her is Andy Peterson. He is with the Society of Actuaries. He's a senior staff fellow for retirement systems there and has done some great research and analysis on how these two pieces that we're discussing today, disability and retirement, interact. Next to him is Lisa Ekman, who I've also gotten to know well from our work on the Social Security Disability Insurance Working Group. Lisa is with NOSCR, the National Organization of Social Security Claimants Representatives, and she's the Director of Government Affairs there. And finally, next to me here is Winthrop Cashdollar, who is with America's Health Insurance Plans. He's the Executive Director of Product Policy. And I think an important component of this is the private sector and the role that that plays in insuring against disability risk. And so one of the things that I really enjoy about BPC is being able to bring together such a diverse array of perspectives, industry, business, consumer, academic representatives that can give a really complete picture of these issues and offer a variety of perspectives. So I think we're going to hear some disagreement on the panel today. I fully expect that. I don't think we'll have all the solutions to these problems, but I think we're going to explore some innovative solutions that policymakers might consider and also employers might consider as we move forward. So I want to start off by asking Jack to give a short overview of his findings that he is releasing here today. All of you probably have a couple pages. One is a sort of front and back summary, bullet point summary of the findings, as well as a front and back graphs that illustrate some of those. And it's new research on the impact that disability insurance, private disability insurance, can have on people's retirement security, or in particular, their retirement savings shortfalls. So with that, let me turn it over to Jack to begin.
Thank you, Shai. It's a pleasure to be back here at BPC. And as Shai mentioned, the primary objective of today's short presentation is to give you some highlights on a project that we've been conducting for the last year or so on how to try to quantify the impact of, in essence, long-term disability insurance on retirement readiness. Now, I want to spend just a couple of minutes, and hopefully you all have the two handouts in front of you, going through how we define retirement readiness, because it's going to make a huge difference with respect to how you interpret the graphs we're going to get to in just a couple of seconds. Many years ago, actually in the late 90s, EBRI started building a full-scale microsimulation model for retirement income adequacy. As I'm sure most of you realize, at least in the current environment, as more and more employers have gone from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans, that other than Social Security, the vast majority of most of the retirement wealth is going to be coming from defined contribution plans. We are very fortunate. Since 1996, we've been in a collaborative effort with the Investment Company Institute and have built easily the largest 401k database in the world. Currently, we have about 27 million participants in about 70,000 plans. This is all microdata, so literally we know to the penny what your contributions, your asset allocation, your account balances are, et cetera. Which is very, very important when you want to try and model something like this, because as Rick mentioned in the beginning, so much of this is going to be tied in with leakages if people are disabled prior to retirement and they don't have adequate long-term disability insurance. So we have built a full model, defined contribution, defined benefits, Social Security, home equity, IRAs, et cetera. And then when we get them out to retirement age, we do 1,000 different possible life paths so we can bring in longevity risk, investment risk, long-term care risk. So basically we try and model reality the best that we can. Now, what we were asked to do was try to look, and the full paper will be coming out a little bit later on this year, and there'll be a lot of sensitivity analysis in addition to just the highlights I'm presenting today, but to look at least at baseline results, what would be the impact once somebody has retired on what we're defining to be retirement savings shortfalls. And very quickly, the way to think of a retirement savings shortfall is if somebody is going to literally run out of money in retirement. I mean, they have Social Security coming in, but basically if they're not going to be able to cover those expenses in retirement, they exhausted their IRA, their 401k, they sold the house, they've taken out the equity, etc. What amount of expenditures will they have that basically they will not have money for? We take the present value of those expenses that are not going to be able to be paid at retirement age, and we call that somebody's retirement savings shortfall. And we've done it for everybody currently aged 35 to 64 in the country, and we have an overall retirement savings shortfall currently of $4.13 trillion. Basically, that's how much additional money they would need in today's dollars by the time they hit 65 in their accounts to forego any retirement savings shortfalls. So what we've done for this analysis today, if you do have the text in front of you, this is actually on the second page under Modeling the Impact of Disability Insurance on Retirement Income Adequacy. There's many more scenarios we have in the full paper, but this is what I wanted to use today very quickly to just show you the overall highlights. We've got first a baseline assumption for the disabled employees. Now I realize a lot of you will argue this is not going to be true for everybody, but at least to get started, we're assuming that disabled employees are going to withdraw their accumulated savings as long as the funds remain to attempt to meet a 60% of previous wage threshold for current living expenses. In the full paper, we have different percentages, but we're starting with 60%. We will assume if you, because of leakages, take out everything you have in your 401k and your IRA, that you will continue to take out loans to basically support that. It factors in Social Security disability insurance, as mentioned earlier, so we try and get this as close as possible to reality. The alternative scenario assumption we're making just for today is that all employees are going to purchase group long-term disability insurance. We can talk about how to facilitate that later, I'm sure, but it's going to provide 60% replacement of previous earnings at time of disability. There's not going to be a COLA, and we're going to subject them to a 90-day waiting period. We assume, at least in the scenario we're showing today, we're going to have sensitivity analysis around this, that during the time you're disabled, if you do have LTD, that you will make 60% of the pre-disability employee contribution as a contribution to an IRA. But since you're not in an employer-sponsored plan, there will not be any employer contributions going in for you during that time. So what do the overall results show? Again, if you have the graphs, there's 4 different graphs here. If I could just direct your attention to Figure A. This is only breaking it out by age, and we're only showing individuals who become disabled sometime prior to 65. We have other results, obviously, that will look at the entire population, but we're trying to focus in on just the disabled employees. Figure A is for anyone disabled of any duration whatsoever. And basically, if you want to just focus on the leftmost column, these are the youngest people we model, currently 35 to 39. These are individuals that sometime between that age and 65 will be disabled, all durations put together. We have an overall reduction in this retirement savings shortfall, this retirement deficit, of a present value of $34,000. Now, what is that in percentage terms? It's actually about 34%. So we can say of those people who become disabled for any duration whatsoever in that age range, we're reducing the retirement deficits if they have the LTD insurance, and we're incorporating the cost of the LTD insurance. We're assuming the employees are paying that by about 34%. Okay, that looks at everybody. If you look down at Figure B instead, we're now filtering out anybody whose duration is less than 5 years. So now we're probably looking at what most people would consider a more catastrophic event, disability of at least 5 years. And as you would imagine, those numbers increase significantly. Again, if you look at people 35 to 39, that number jumps over $100,000. It's up to $106,000. And that number represents a 60% reduction in what the people would have if they did not have disability insurance. So basically, the LTD provision is reducing retirement deficits if you've been disabled for at least 5 years by 60%. Now, if you look at figure C and D on the back pages, we also break it out by income. Now, I think some of you will probably be a little bit curious as to why there's such an impact in terms of the income breakouts. But remember, because SSDI is there, that much of what is happening in terms of overall reductions of retirement deficits is happening for the higher income people. In fact, if you look at figure C, people 35 to 39 in the highest income quartile. Now, this is income quartiles measured across your entire career, much like Social Security does average index monthly earnings. We have a $64,000 reduction, which represents about a 64% reduction in retirement deficits for those people disabled of any duration if you're in the highest income quartile. Just to quickly wrap this up, if you look at figure D on the bottom, again, this is broken out by age and it's broken out by income quartile. But now again, we're looking only at those people who have been disabled for at least 5 years. If you look at the highest income quartile, we're reducing on average retirement deficits by about $181,000, which represents a 77% reduction in retirement deficits for those with a disability of at least that duration that have disability insurance versus those that don't. Now, I'm sure what a lot of the conversation later on today is going to focus on is basically how do you get long-term disability insurance effectively to these individuals, whether we're going to do automatic enrollment, whether we're going to do some kind of an opt-in situation. A lot of what we're going to be doing in the full issue brief later this year is to look at various sensitivity analysis around things like opt-out rates if you do automatic enrollment, and basically also look at different patterns of employee behavior that disabled employees might follow if they're disabled. Are they going to, in essence, if I had been putting in 6% of employee pay as a contribution to a 401k when it's matched, I take away the match because I'm in an IRA, does that mean necessarily I'm going to reduce the overall contribution going in? Those are the types of things we'll be looking at in the full issue brief. So thank you very much, Shai.
Thanks, Jack. And I think that putting this in the context of the statistic that Jim led off with, which is that a quarter of people who are entering the workforce roughly at the age of 20 or 21 will experience some work-limiting disability before they reach normal retirement age, is really important because it's clearly a problem, it's clearly a risk that a lot of the population faces. And so I think Jack's modeling is showing what sort of a goal could be if we found a way to protect those people against that risk. Now, there's a lot of disagreement, and I think even taking a further step back about how we should be covering these people, what the balance is between public coverage and Social Security disability insurance, and where the private sector fits into this, and that's part of what I want to get into with the panel today. But I think there's undoubtedly a risk that all of us face that we don't think about enough on a daily basis. And so what types of interventions, be they public or private, can we have in order to help insure people against this? So with that context, why don't we just go down the panel, starting with Aaliyah maybe, and just give some reactions to Jack's research and the context of this problem as a whole, and what, if anything, do you think this research sheds on what potential solutions policymakers and employers, et cetera, might consider?
Sure. Thank you, Shai and the Bipartisan Policy Center for holding this conference and for inviting the Chamber. Jack's research is great, and I think it really supports what we've been looking at over the last year or so. So the Chamber, probably for the third year, has put out a white paper. We issued one in February, and for the first time this year, we did include a recommendation about educating people more about private disability insurance. And it really is based on the information that Jack provided, that when we were looking at retirement readiness and this lack of retirement readiness, we need to look beyond just people accumulating enough money, that there are life events that happen that impact retirement readiness, and how as employers we can help with that and contribute to that. So at the Chamber, we, one, have taken, at this point, an educational process about it and looking at it not in terms of where we usually look at this in our labor division, but actually in our retirement division and how that plays into the retirement process. We have done some work looking at this with automatic enrollment. I think probably one of the debates is whether that should be mandated or not. I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear that the Chamber does not support a mandate. But we do think that for employers who feel like it's helpful for their workforce, this should be something that they should be able to implement and could be helpful as they move forward with their workforce. I'll leave it at that.
Great, yeah, we can keep these brief and then we'll get into a broader discussion. But yeah, Andy.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Shai, and to the Bipartisan Policy Commission. I guess from the perspective we've been taking at the Society of Actuaries is we have a lot of our volunteers and members who raise different issues with us, and we're both an education and research-based institution. One of our members, Anna Rappaport, who I'm sure a few of you in the audience know, she's a tireless member and volunteer for us. She's raised this issue of disability risk in the retirement security context. So as Jack sort of alluded to, looking at sort of the present value of retirement needs, one of the things that we've seen and are really just trying to really raise awareness of this issue is that as we move from this defined benefit world to more of an individual defined contribution, individual responsibility world, that somehow along the way we sort of forgot about the disability coverage. So in your typical defined benefit plan, most of the time you would have you might actually have an LTD benefit in the DB plan. At a minimum, most DB plans at least have a sort of a continuing accrual of benefit service towards that ultimate retirement benefit at normal retirement age. But in a DC world, when you stop contributing or become disabled, the contributions stop, and all of a sudden that account balance doesn't grow anywhere other than with interest, and maybe it doesn't even grow with interest because the person might not have LTD coverage, and now they're required to sort of, you got that leakage issue that Jack referenced. So what we've been trying to do is just sort of raise awareness. There have been some changes in regulation recently that have allowed some things to happen that you might be able to have sort of a disability benefit that does sort of a premium waiver or contribution continuation sort of thing for employees while they're on disability, and that's really what we've been talking about recently.
Great. Please.
So thank you for having me here, and thank you for the research. And I think there are a couple of things that I think are important to keep in mind. When you think about people who have retirement accounts, it's a little bit over 5 in 10. 45% have no retirement savings. When you think about the number of people who have access to any benefits through an employer, it's important to keep in mind that 4 in 10 don't have access to a single paid sick day. 4 in 10 don't even have access to unpaid sick days because they aren't covered by the Family Medical Leave Act. 1 in 7 workers does not have health insurance, despite the progress that's been made in getting coverage for people. And so what happens to individuals when they acquire a disability is going to be really different based on the type of employment that you have and where your income is. And while this research clearly shows that private disability insurance can have a positive impact on retirement security, I would suspect that the 1/3 of people who already have private disability insurance are probably also some of those higher earners that are going to be most impacted. And what really I think we need to think about and focus on is I suspect that there's also a lot of overlap for the 1/3 in terms of having those retirement accounts and having savings. So when we think about the 6 in 10 that have no money in the bank or less than $1,000 in the bank, and we think about the people, so they can't save anything at all, let alone retirement, I suspect there is a fair overlap there. How do we best and most efficiently help the people who currently don't have private disability insurance and who don't have savings, who may not have health insurance, who may not have access to paid sick leave? And how can we address that publicly as well as privately? And I think we would have to have a conversation about long-term care and how that gets paid for, health insurance and how that gets paid for, and how we address some of the issues for the lowest quartile of earners and the bottom 50%, because when you look at the lowest quartile, nearly 2/3 have no paid sick leave, and part-time workers who have no paid sick leave. And so we have to be thinking about how this fits into what Senator Warner was talking about, the changes in the economy, and shoring up our public systems, and whether it's more efficient to do that as opposed to turn to private solutions.
Great, thanks. Winthrop?
Well, thank you, Shai, for hosting this event and for having me part of it. Well, the research brings into clearer focus just one of the benefits of private disability income protection. I saw a different version of what I think the audience has, and I noted that for people with a disability onset of 5 years duration in their late 30s, there's a six-figure positive impact on their retirement readiness. For some of the income quartiles of people with disability onset in their early 40s, there's also a six-figure. There are lesser impacts at other ages and income quartiles, but still significant. So the disability income protection also helps with retirement income security. It helps keep the families of disabled workers out of hardship during their working years. It brings return to work supports and assistance to people who may be able to benefit from them. And it also relieves the burden on some public programs. And so for all these reasons, and including retirement security, I think it's a better thing for more people to have disability income protection. And I hope and expect that this forum will focus extensively on the people with the needs that you described, Lisa.
Thanks, Winthrop. So I want to divide the discussion, and we don't have too much time, and I also want to leave time for audience questions into sort of two pieces. One is the disability insurance piece, where people's income is replaced by either SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance, or a private product. And then the other is what Andy alluded to, which is replacing people's retirement savings, because that gets into the part of where this disability and retirement overlap, because when you experience a disability, you obviously don't have that stream of income that you can put away some of it for your ultimate retirement. So starting with the first piece, we know that only about 1/3 or so of employees in the United States are covered by some type of private disability insurance that will supplement their SSDI benefits. And what do you think is the reason for why that number is only about 1/3? And whether it's financial for the employers, whether it's legal, other reasons, whether the employees don't find that it's a benefit for them. And then second, what do you think should be the breakdown in terms of how SSDI plays a role for some of these people? Clearly it's a bigger role for folks at the bottom. And then what people need to be thinking about when they're supplementing that on top in case they do experience a disability. So I don't know, why don't we start, Lisa, do you want to kick it off?
So I think it's a complicated question. I think that there are a lot of factors that you want to take into account with this. I think for the vast majority of people, I think to go back to what Senator Warner's remarks, private disability insurance has generally been offered as a part of a package of benefits to employees, to attract employees and to keep employees. And the nature of our economy has changed. Things like factory jobs, where a low-skilled worker could make a living and get a full benefit package, really don't exist in the way that they did. And we've moved to a retail and a service economy where there isn't the kind of commitment from employers to keeping employees, so they don't offer it. I would say that more than 6 in 10 people having no savings means that employees are not going to be able to afford to purchase insurance. And we need to make sure they already have an insurance product that they pay for and their employer does through SSDI. So we need to make sure that what additional coverage they might get would be of value to them. And for a lot of employees, I think that it may not be. And I think that we need to carefully think about how it fits in with what they already have and their current financial situation. I wrote a paper for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that talks about a lot of the issues that I'm raising right now that you can find on their website, and specifically looks at the proposal to auto-enroll people into private disability insurance. And so I urge people to take a look at that paper because there are a lot of questions. For example, currently most private disability insurance policies have an almost dollar for dollar offset to SSDI. So if I purchase one and I'm a lower income worker, my SSDI replacement rate is going to be higher than for a higher earner. Am I going to actually get more benefit financially from purchasing that? So we have to think about that. Does it make sense to take a look at SSDI, strengthen it, and expand it to make it work better? Is it more efficient to do that? Or is it more efficient for the workers who aren't currently covered to get private disability coverage? I think we really need to take a look at that because I think that the uncovered workers are very dissimilar in many ways to the covered workers. Now, we need to make sure that if we're looking at expanding it, we make sure that the products that they're buying are of value and designed to work for them, given the fact that they may not have sick leave, they may not have health insurance, and some of the other things that help support private disability insurance to get the outcomes they do for the workers currently covered.
Gotcha. Winthrop, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, I think Jack's modeling shows a little bit that for that bottom quintile, there's less of a benefit. I mean, part of it is because their incomes are smaller, and so by nature, they're going to have smaller retirement savings shortfalls because they have lower expenditures. But what is your perspective on sort of who can benefit most from these types of supplementary income in case of a disability, and what role something like automatic enrollment can play?
Lisa has talked about a vulnerable population. So in some ways, from some perspectives, they actually would need disability income protection more. And a presumption here today is that people who are lower paid workers who are disabled, that they're going to apply for and get their Social Security. And in many cases that's true, but it's only, upon initial determination, it's only about a third. And so these especially vulnerable people with the inability to access surplus funds or savings, they could be, first of all, unable to get their Social Security disability benefits. They may never get them, but in the meantime, the Deputy Commissioner reported or testified to Congress earlier this year that the wait times for a hearing for a benefit determination was approaching 17 months. So there's many scenarios under which people would be able to benefit greatly from private coverage, even if they were eligible for Social Security disability eventually, but certainly if they never became eligible. And in addition, it's almost universal that private disability income protection policies include a minimum benefit. So the notion that there's no or never or little value for even the lower paid workers, it just doesn't always hold true.
Aaliyah, in terms of the employer perspective here, what do you think the view is on why some have chosen not to include this in a benefits package or have it available for their employees?
Sure. Well, I think Lisa actually raises highlights one of the tensions that's in the employer community. One of the reasons we tend to oppose general mandates or mandates generally is that it doesn't take into account the differences in workforces. I mean, we have a segment of employers that have over 100% turnover per year. So in that context, offering benefits becomes pretty much impossible. You don't have workers there for enough time for them to benefit, to educate them, to make it worthwhile. So from the employer perspective, you're constantly trying to provide benefits that are helpful to your workforce, and you're also trying to run your business. So that's a tension there that you're constantly trying to work through. Going to the automatic enrollment, I mean, one of the reasons we do support that in terms of it being a voluntary option is that there is the value of taking advantage of inertia and getting people involved. I was listening to a panel yesterday where employers were talking about how many things they do offer, and you're right, it depends on the employer and their workforce. But sometimes there's so many offerings that employees don't know what's out there, and then education becomes a process. And disability insurance may not apply to everybody, and so trying to get people to understand the importance of it, or any insurance really, I think is the same. People might not want to pay for something that they're never going to use, and educating on the importance of that is another issue. And you have various employers that are willing to put more time into that than others.
Yeah, I mean, we do see that very much in the retirement space, which, of course, our Retirement Security Commission, led by Jim Lockhart, was focused on, which is that if we don't automatically enroll people, you see very different levels of savings than if you put them in and with the option to decide not to contribute if they want to. And I think it's even more true when it comes to insurance products like this, that when people aren't thinking about that disability risk, I know I certainly don't think about it on a regular basis, nearly as much even as I would think about retirement saving, then you're going to get lower rates than ideal, regardless of what the ideal enrollment should be and whether there are certain populations who it wouldn't benefit. If you don't have it in some type of automatic fashion, then it's just going to be an underutilized product, whatever that ideal or right level of utilization should be. I think the second component of all of this is when we think about people's contributions to retirement accounts, and when somebody experiences a disability, those tend to stop because they no longer have that stream of income and may not be employed by, in many cases, not be employed by the employer anymore. And so there, Andy, you were alluding to this in your opening remarks, that there are some recent regulations that have changed the ability of employers to offer a product that would help people replace contributions to their retirement accounts in case they do experience a disability. And so could you explain a little bit more about what those regulations are and what the policies that are now allowed, although I know that we haven't seen a whole lot of employer take up yet?
Yeah, so I'm not necessarily an expert on the regs, but my understanding was, and prior to about, I think it was May of 2014, the way that contributions are treated, if you were to do sort of a continuation of DC contributions during disability, it really couldn't do it because of the taxation and that sort of thing. And the regulations were changed in 2 years ago that allows a continuation of a benefit to be paid as long as a few conditions are met. I believe one of them is that the contributions are made like as sort of considered as an investment option, and that there's not, if money's coming back to the individual, then that sort of, you lose that benefit as well. But the idea is that effectively you could have, like I said before, a waiver premium option, so that somebody who is, rather than let's just say they're contributing 6% and getting the employer match at 3%, so you've got 9% going into that 401k program, you could continue to have that 9% going in as long as that person is still at least associated with the employer through a disability arrangement. And that, as I think Jack would show in his modeling, would have a huge impact on retirement security. This whole thing is a bit of a chicken and egg thing, though. As we sort of investigated this, we're aware of a couple large employers that have done this, but as you talk to the employers, you try and track down even insurance companies, it's sort of a chicken and egg thing where the insurance companies are generally saying, well, we're not hearing the demand for this product. And the employers are saying, well, nobody's talking we don't know if the product actually exists, or in some cases it's just one more thing of this array of benefits that we're already providing, and we're not sure anybody's actually going to value it because people don't employees as a whole, all of us sort of underestimate our own likelihood of becoming disabled. So you have that challenge there.
Gotcha. And Jack, how does this fit in on the modeling side in terms of replacing people's retirement savings contributions as well as their income?
Well, that was not what we did today, but one of the other things, as soon as I can figure out good premium estimates for this policy, that's one of the things we're going to be including in the issue brief. We have very good information on what the employee and employer contributions are for these individuals broken out by certain demographic groups. So I agree 100% with what Andy said, and that's one of the things we're looking for. So if you've got any premium estimates on that, just please let us know, because I just haven't, I can do the benefit part, I haven't been able to do the cost part of that yet.
So I have a few more questions, but if we have the mics, I don't know if we have them ready yet. Maybe not, we're a few minutes early. So let me ask, oh, they're coming? Does anyone in the audience have a question? Yeah. And if we could have, I know I was at a BPC event a couple years ago, this sticks in my mind, where the moderator asked for only questions and somebody got up and said, I have a question in the form of a statement. And so we'd appreciate if we kept them to actual questions for the panel.
Well, I did want to expand on something Andrew addressed with this regulation. I think it's important to understand that we actually started to make some progress in this area in the late 90s. And some of those employers that have adopted these plans did so in the late 90s. The IRS issued proposed rules that would have made all accident and health insurance in defined contribution plans taxable benefits in about 2006. So while that rule was out there pending, it had a completely chilling effect on the marketplace. Those employers that had adopted it said, we're not going to promote it. And those who hadn't adopted it that were interested, and there were a number that were going to adopt it, said, we're not going to adopt something that could then become taxable and we'd have to withdraw it tomorrow. So we waited 8 years for the IRS to finalize those rules, and they did include this important exemption that now permits it. But I think it can't be sort of overstated, because insurance companies like Unum, who created a product for that market at that time and then couldn't sell it, were very frustrated after that kind of an investment in filing costs and so forth. So we've had an additional amount of inertia getting employers to adopt the plan, even on a voluntary basis. And I think the question is, what are the obstacles right now? And what we're finding is that it has to do with lack of clarity on whether they can do it on an auto-enroll basis. And also, of course, there's this new complexity with the fiduciary rules and what an impact that has on how these products are ultimately offered to retirement plans and participants.
Andy, do you want to follow up on any of that, or?
No, he's got a little more history than I had. I remember hearing some of that, but yeah, that's definitely.
Gotcha. Did anyone else want to weigh in on the retirement products, replacing retirement contribution products in terms of employers? Or? No. All right. Why don't we go over?
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. It's Carl Polzer. This is just a request for more information so we can consider this issue about how the SSDI, the Social Security Disability Insurance, and the private group insurance coordinate. Is it a primary, secondary insurer kind of deal? Do they act independently? Just from a practical point of view, somebody has a stroke, they're a $40,000 a year employee, they apply for SSDI, it takes 2.5 years. They also have this private insurance. What kicks in when, and what affects what at what point?
Yeah, that's a great question. And why don't we go Winthrop and then Lisa or others who want to weigh in after for some of that context.
So first, I want to acknowledge, and thank you for the question, Carl. I want to acknowledge that private disability income protection policies do vary. So anything that I say is not universal, but might be considered typical. It is typical in group long-term disability policies for the amount of the private disability benefit to be reduced by the amount of an SSDI benefit. And the reasons for that, in part, are to keep the coverage affordable. Because in a market where you have penetration of only about a third of workers in private industry, affordability at the margin is very, very important. So it helps to keep the benefit important, which is a very, very key feature of private disability income protection. It also prevents situations in which a person's post-disability income is either more than or almost the same as or too close to their pre-disability income, which has important incentive effects on the capacity and the willingness to return to work when that's appropriate and feasible. So it's also typical, though not universal, for long-term disability plans to have a 3-month or a 6-month waiting period, and the SSDI waiting period is 5 months. So private disability income protection is designed to complement Social Security disability insurance, which for almost all workers is something that would be of benefit to them and necessary to prevent hardship.
So Yeah, just a couple of things on that. I think, we can look at the offsets as an implicit subsidy from SSDI to private disability insurance to keep premiums low. And so we need to think about, if we're expanding coverage, what does that mean for SSDI, and how do we think about that in terms of whether that's the most efficient investment? I think it's important to note, too, that while people do get approved for SSDI at the first application level, there are different definitions between private disability insurance and SSDI. So for example, for the first 2 years, many private disability insurance policies only require that you can't do your own occupation, as opposed to not being able to do any occupation in the national economy, which is the SSDI definition. So there will be people who qualify for private disability insurance and won't qualify for SSDI because of that difference. And it is true that sometimes they're much quicker in terms of getting coverage, but there are people who have to appeal with private disability insurance and go to court as well. So let's make sure, if we're talking about how quick people get approved, that we're comparing apples and apples and not apples and oranges, because there are people who have to go through that whole process as well. So I think also, when you think about SSDI, SSDI does have a lower replacement rate for people who make more money because of the tax cap, which we could talk about whether or not we ought to change that as well. But because as you pay more, there is a cap to the benefit level that you can get. But for lower workers, their replacement rate from SSDI often is very, very close to what someone would get through private disability insurance. And it is also the case that many policies, and again, as Winthrop said, they differ, but many policies require anyone who's getting benefits to also apply for any other benefit for which they are eligible. So if there is a workers' comp benefit, if there is an SSDI, they will help them apply for it and get that benefit. So that's what I was kind of referencing when I said we need to make sure it's of value. For higher workers whose replacement rate may be closer to 40% under SSDI, there is a significant difference between the amount that they get from private disability and SSDI. For lower income workers who may have closer to a 60% disability benefit rate, replacement rate, especially when you take into account family benefits and the other benefits that come in the package of insurance that people pay for through Social Security, they may not be getting much more income than they would if they just had SSDI. So those are all things to keep in mind as well.
I just want to add, sure. I neglected to say that on average, private disability income protection claims are paid within about 30 days. And I should have added that when I talked about the length of time that people often have to wait. There are 1 million people waiting for a hearing for SSDI benefit awards. So I don't dispute the math, but I do want to draw attention to the other scenarios of people who are disabled and able to get private disability benefits, but either never get SSDI benefits or have to wait a terribly long time. And if they're in that vulnerable income category, then it's certainly a value in addition to the minimum benefit. And I'll stop. I hope to have another chance to speak, but I'll stop now.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Sure.
You think we'll ever see anything like an expanding of Social Security to move towards like universal basic income? Because you look how many people are claiming Social Security early when they have no choice. More people are going on to SSDI as the population ages.
Sure. So you mean replacing all sort of the whole consortium of benefits?
Like expanding Social Security and coming up with like a universal basic income?
Does anyone have? I mean, I guess that's a little bit outside the scope of the discussion today, but there certainly have been proposals to basically get rid of, or not get rid of, replace all of the government benefit programs with some type of catch-all universal income. I don't know. I think that's probably a little beyond the discussion today, which is really just focused on the disability and retirement interaction, but certainly an important.
That is one thing that you see nowadays is more people are claiming Social Security early, more people are going on SSDI due to knee, hip, and other stuff.
Yeah. Sure. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Andy.
Be careful to wade in here, but I guess the one thing I just offer is that I think, and this isn't a position of my organization or anything, but as you're looking at longer life expectancy, there's a lot of debate about this the normal retirement age under Social Security. I could imagine, though, that if you were to push out that age, some changes to SSDI to deal with people who don't believe or are in classes of work that maybe doesn't make sense to push out that, and those groups aren't experiencing the same life expectancy gains that maybe the broad population is, that some expansion or rejiggering of the SSDI program to help those specific targeted populations could make a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's a great point. Brian?
Hi, I'm Brian Collins. Thanks for all coming here today. Many of you may know that the Senate Finance Committee recently passed out some legislation with a strong bipartisan vote to create what they're calling pooled employer plans, which would be retirement plans that would be operated by a third-party provider instead of the employer, and would remove a lot of the responsibilities employers have. And the idea is this could expand retirement savings make it a lot easier for employers that don't currently offer a retirement plan. And so my question is, could you see, is there a way that either some kind of long-term disability coverage could be added to that pooled employer plan concept, either to replace the earnings or also to focus on some of the retirement risks, replacing the missing contributions, as Andy has talked about? What are your thoughts about that? Is that promising? Does that address some of Senator Warner's concerns about these sort of gaps that have occurred in kind of the social benefit system?
Great, thanks, Brian. Anyone want to start us off on that question?
I'll try.
Winthrop, then Andy.
Well, I can't say that I've spent enough time or looked into that, a link between what's moving on Capitol Hill and the potential to add some disability income protection features. But I will say that the current state of the market, the current lack of coverage by 2/3 of workers, and for example, the slowness of what Andy was talking about to catch on, shows that policymakers would be well serving their constituents to look at other alternatives. As the proposal you discussed, I think, raises some pretty intricate administrative and legal problems, but if they can be solved, I think it could be part of a solution.
Andy?
I was going to say, I think this concept of multiple employer plans, where you have these independent agencies offering plans to non-related employers, makes a lot of sense from my perspective. Again, these are my personal views. The Society of Actuaries did a project about 5 years ago that we called Retirement 2020, which was about sort of envisioning a new retirement system, sort of ground up without sort of the current structures. And we had people write papers on ideas, and a number of the papers that when we asked for specific designs were really along this concept of almost a clearinghouse concept, where you have a defined contribution in nature, at least on the accumulation side, but you have great administrative, you're getting the scale of size with your administration and that sort of thing that a lot of small employers don't have. And it seems like in addition to your sort of 401k balance, maybe your contributions in there, I'm not sure what the right number is, but an additional 1% of pay that might be going towards this disability coverage in different forms could seem like it would make a lot of sense. And I'm not sure if there would be some regulatory changes that would be needed just to make all of that work, but conceptually it seems like it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, Leah, I mean, it would definitely make it administratively simpler for a lot of businesses that are concerned about the complexities of offering it today.
And the Chamber has supported the multiple employer plans, definitely in the retirement context. Haven't talked about expanding it, but I think it makes sense. And I think it highlights another issue that employers are dealing with, and that was raised by Senator Warner, in terms of how much responsibility the employers want for providing kind of all of these benefits, and how far that goes and how much they can provide. And so this kind of option where it is a third party takes some of that off of the employer and gives them another option that can help them kind of expand what they offer for employees.
I have a quick question before we go to another question from the audience, if there are more. Lisa, for you, I know you've done a lot of research on workforce attachment, or thinking about workforce attachment, and it's something that actually Winthrop mentioned in his comment earlier, that we need to make sure that the incentives are right, but also that people understand that obviously the best impact that they can have for their future financial situation, retirement security, if possible, and it's certainly not possible in all cases, is to return to work. And so what are some thoughts that you have on how we can maximize the likelihood of return to work and help people prepare for retirement when it's possible in that fashion, or think about their future financial considerations?
So I think that's really complicated, but I do think some of the things that I already mentioned would go a long way towards that. Thinking about how we get sick leave for people, for people who are in jobs where they don't have sick leave and even unpaid sick leave, there isn't a lot of ways to keep them attached. We need to be really careful that anything we do doesn't create disincentives for hiring people that already have disabilities. So we have to think about any solutions on that way, because sometimes you can create incentives to keep people on the job that might also discourage hiring in the first place of people who have existing health conditions and disabilities. We need to, I think, it's a really complicated question based on the changes that have happened in our economy. I think that when you have someone who has a white-collar job, who's skilled, there are things that you can do quite easily often that will keep them at the job. You can look at alternate work schedules. You can look at better ergonomics for their workplace if they have a back injury or something like that. And you can look at getting them some better access to vocational services. But we also need to make sure that people have adequate and affordable health care, because if someone can't afford treatment, they're not going to be able to get to work. So we are back to work. We need to think about how that works. Thinking about ways we can do, encourage job sharing and alternate work arrangements that can help people return to work to the extent that they're able. But I do think we really need to think about also the changes in the nature of the economy, and how for some jobs it's going to be very difficult for that individual to ever return to that job. And as Senator Warner talked about, we need to think about job training. But I think when we think about job retraining and upskilling people in white collar, or people with skills or college education or above, it's very different than when we think about someone who may be a construction worker or who may be a barista at Starbucks. And how do we think about retraining or uptraining them? And I would say we don't, frankly, do a very good job at that. And that we need to think about how we as a country are going to assist people with lower skills and lower education levels to adapt to the economy and be able to have jobs irrespective of whether they have a disability, but especially when they acquire a health condition or a disability that makes it difficult to work full-time or to work at a job that they previously had.
Yeah, there's so many issues there, and it's a big issue that BPC's Disability Insurance Working Group spent a lot of time discussing and actually made some interesting recommendations on. But Winthrop, I know the private disability insurers, at least some of them, have been looked at as good examples of some innovative things that can be tried to help keep people attached to the workforce. So do you have thoughts on?
So, absolutely. I mean, I think the simple answer is if you want to get more working Americans who have disability onset or impairment, if you want to get more of them back in the workplace, then you need to get more of them private disability income coverage. I want to acknowledge what Lisa's been saying about the difference between the SSDI program and private disability insurance, and the difference between the population that's covered for private disability insurance and the population that's not. But even so, the private disability insurers with which I've worked, and I have to acknowledge the help that I've gotten from Unum and other companies, they are uniquely situated to work with a disabled employee, that employee's employer, that employee's treating physicians and other specialists to align their motivations and incentives, and to get them all on the same page. I know people first often think of perhaps assistive technology, but the lessons I've learned is that it has so much to do with people who are trying to let people know what's possible. An injured employee doesn't know what can be done or what it would take or if it's even possible. So the private insurers, they intervene early, and they communicate and they align and they motivate and they encourage. Yes, they sometimes provide assistive technology, but that's only just a small part of it. And the beneficiaries of these interventions are not just the employee, but their retirement accounts would benefit. We've commissioned research that shows that the SSDI program itself is a beneficiary. And in terms of being able to do something with policy to get more people returning to work, more private coverage is needed because it's been devilishly hard to change the SSDI program. And they tried, I guess it was some 16 years ago, or no, 26 years, no, 16 years ago, they enacted the Ticket to Work program. And that, although good, well-intentioned, just simply hasn't worked. So if you want really to get something going, yes, consider changes to the SSDI program, but not only that.
Does anyone else want to, Aaliyah?
Yeah, just to add real quickly, and I think this goes a little bit back to what I was saying earlier. A lot of these issues in the employer community sometimes can't be resolved completely within the employer. And so while the employer can do certain things, we've had this situation where we talk about worker engagement, that if the community isn't equipped to kind of help people with disabilities, then the employer is not equipped to do that solely on its own. And it can be things like public transportation. I mean, we live in a city where we have public transportation, but a lot of places do not. And so if an employee can't even get to work, I'm not sure how much the employer can do to maintain that kind of engagement. And things like job training, I mean, some of that can be done at the employer level, but a lot of that would be better served at the community level to help the employers with that. So I think there needs to be a comprehensive thinking about how all of this works together.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, if there are any more from the audience. Great. Oh, yep.
Question going back to this idea of people opting into insurance, and we know and opting in, opting out, obviously there's a lot of complexity, but rather than looking at the issue about whether people should be opted in or opted out, is there any thought about innovations in products that make them more appealing to consumers? Somebody made the point that people don't take on disability insurance because they don't think they're going to need it, and people know they need emergency savings, people know they need retirement savings, people know they need lots of other types of products and services to manage their financial lives. Is there any innovation happening among employers or in the insurance sector to make the products more appealing and maybe help people sort of manage those day to day, as well as think about the thing that they hope they won't ever need?
Great, thanks.
Well, study after study, survey after survey has shown that working Americans underestimate their risk of disability. They underestimate the financial risk of disability. They often overestimate the help that will be available to them for income replacement. So to a degree, automatic enrollment is an innovation. Through inertia, through the power of inertia, it helps people better serve their self-interest than they have been doing by themselves. So that's an innovation that's been shown to work in other areas of the financial security industry. Now, I'm obligated to say that AHIP currently is neutral on automatic enrollment. AHIP was a strong proponent of automatic enrollment in private disability income plans. But when our conversations on Capitol Hill turned more and more to demands to encumber it with greater regulatory and legislative burden, we lost our member consensus, and we had to stand down.
Lisa, I don't know if you can speak to the innovations that's going on in terms of the industry, but from a sort of consumer perspective, employee perspective, what do you think might be a more attractive, or what elements of the product could be made more attractive so that it's providing greater benefits to the people that it's serving?
That is also a complicated question, Shai, but I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think one thing is that there are some of the kinds of improvements that caused AHIP to no longer want to support auto-enrollment ought to be looked at in terms of, for example, when you think about auto-enrollment in a 401k, if you leave your job or you stop contributing, you still have the money that's in it. When you are auto-enrolled in a private disability plan, if you leave your job, there's no value to that premium that you paid. And I understand that the value is the coverage that you had while you paid the premium, but it's a very different situation. There were also, when 401ks were auto-enrollment was allowed, lots of regulations around what those 401k plans could look like, what the notices had to look like, what the employer responsibilities were. And so you need to think about that. I think that, you know, for the vast majority of workers, they're already paying for an insurance product. And so what, again, I'll go back to, and what I talk about in the paper that I did for the Center on Budget, is that you have to make sure there's value to it above and beyond what they're already paying for, and making the case that is the case to people. So I think that there are ways to improve it. I think there are a lot of things that are in the paper that people could take a look at as to ways that you could change policies that would make them more valuable to people, and then maybe easier to get them to opt in, as opposed to auto-enrolling them and asking them to opt out if they don't want the coverage.
Got it. Well, thanks to all of you for joining us today on such an important issue, and one that I think is under-discussed. And thanks very much to Mr. McKinney, Senator Warner, Jack for the great research, and our panelists here today. If we could give them a round of applause. Thank you.